begin? Yes? So, it is my really, really great pleasure, even after 12 years, to introduce Kelly McBride, my friend and colleague, Vice President of Academic Programs and head of the Ethics Faculty at the Poynter Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida. Kelly writes the Everyday Ethics column for Poynter and is a nationally recognized authority on media ethics. Really, she really is that person. She's a thought leader and a strong voice for media ethics and has been the moderator here for 11 of 12 years. I know you all know this, she's here this time. You can read about her many, many accomplishments in your binders, but do that later because she's here now to tell us why covering social justice issues is important and to help guide our discussion all day on the ethics of that coverage. Kelly.
Wow, it's really great to be back. You know, I've done this for so long with Jan. It really is Jan that does all the heavy lifting. I refuse to take any credit for it. And this conference is one of the very few conferences that Poynter co-brands with another organization. And that's because we take the quality of what we put out there with our brand very seriously, and there just are not that many events that we would put our brand on. This is one of them. So, so Jan is awesome. So I want to take you through, and I will, if I have time, we'll do questions. But if we don't, you'll get to ask me questions lots all throughout the day. But I want to take you through a moment of awakening for myself around social justice issues. Describe how that parallels the industry as a whole. So I've been in journalism for 30 years now. I know, and I'm not even exaggerating. Like, that's really like 30 years. And my experience, I think, as a reporter and then as a media ethicist in journalism, I think closely parallels our industry as a whole. And where I think we are right now is a moment of opportunity. And that opportunity is a gift to us as journalists. And it's frankly a gift that we don't quite deserve, but it's been handed to us. And I think we have an obligation to do something with it. So, social justice as a beat. That's what I want to talk about. 15 years ago, I was working at a newspaper in the Northwest part of the country when I suggested to my editor that I cover social justice as a beat. I'd baked up the idea with an old friend from college. I had been a police reporter and a religion reporter, and I was angling for my next career move. And so I wrote up a proposal, and I met with an editor from my paper. It was during my sort of annual evaluation, and I handed him this, and I was like, hey, I think this is like my next job here at the paper. It doesn't exist yet. And I will tell you his reaction in a minute. But that was about 15 years ago. So that was midpoint of my career. But 30 years ago, at the very beginning of my career, I actually started down the road at the Plain Dealer. And one of the most formative moments of my time came during that first summer after I graduated from college. And I'd found a police report, and it detailed, so as an intern at the Plain Dealer, most of what I did was police reporting. Most of the time I was over at the police department and just helping out the full-time police reporters do their job. I had found, and so all of the stories that I covered were specifically within the physical footprint of Cleveland. And I'd found this police report that detailed the misfortunes of these two young British guys who'd been discharged from the army in Britain. They bought the cheapest plane tickets that they could buy to the United States, i.e. Cleveland. And so they get here, they lock all of their belongings in a locker. I can't remember where, but it was somewhere downtown in a public space, probably the bus station. And that includes their passports, the bulk of their cash that they got as like a final discharge from the Army, because remember, this is before ATMs were convenient, and it was before it was easy to get a credit card. So they lock all this stuff in this locker, and they decide they're going to sleep in a public park in Cleveland. And so, of course, they get robbed, right? All of their stuff is stolen. And then the locker, the key to the locker is stolen, and the locker is emptied out too. So here they are, these two guys, and they're stranded in America with only the clothes on their back. So I track them down at the YMCA, and I write this story about these cute Brits with adorable accents and a crappy plight. And it runs on the front page of the Monday morning newspaper. And these guys become instant celebrities. Radio stations take up their cause. Local retailers give them clothing. People donate money. I mean, they were made. And so I was feeling really good about myself, that I'd found this story and changed these guys' lives. And then one of the more seasoned reporters at the paper pointed out a certain disparity in the way that that story was handled compared to the way that most of my stories were handled. So most of my stories did not go on the front page of the paper. And I'd spent that first summer out of college covering crime in Cleveland. I'd written some fairly dramatic stories. When I look back at my clips from that summer, I'm proud of what I did. I wrote about a promising young track athlete who lost his life in a stabbing and how devastating that was to his family. I'd written about families that had been chased from public housing by fires because the public housing was so shitty that the fires started. Oh, I'm sorry, my bad. I forgot we're streaming. You got a 7-second delay? You never thought with me. Who would have thought? So the public housing was so bad that the fires were starting, and they spread fairly quickly. So I'd written a lot of stories that I think could be categorized in the social justice category. And those stories got no play at all, right? They were buried inside the paper. No radio station took up the cause of the people who were featured in those stories. No one really cared. And that's because throughout the 1980s and 90s and well into the 2000s, newspapers in medium and large markets across this country made very distinct choices about how they spent their news resources. So the news resources were devoted to covering the suburbs. And this is true everywhere. This is true universally across the country, and television stations made similar investments. The one exception being the station that focused on crime, and in every market there's usually one. But the stories were not meant to expose injustice or document the lives of the people who were living in the city proper. They were meant to cater to an audience that was outside the city. And as a result, we missed the story. And it's taken my whole entire career for journalism, the profession of journalism, to embrace the notion that social justice merits its own beat. And we're at that point now. And there's a certain irony to this, right? I became a journalist because a high school journalism teacher regaled me with stories of journalists documenting the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War. So Mrs. Topher, Jill Topher was her name. I wonder if she's out there anywhere. But she pointed me to the work of Hazel Brannon Smith and David Havelstram and showed me how powerful journalism can be when we embrace social justice. And we are now, so if you think about it, and this is a line, I'm stealing this from one of my colleagues, Roy Peter Clark. The misery and the hatred of the South gave rise to social justice journalism. And then there was a period in our history as a profession where we squandered that legacy. So we're entering this new golden age of accountability reporting now. I believe that is true. And you can see that in NPR's Code Switch, which is an amazing podcast if you guys don't listen to it. Amazing podcast. You can see that the New York Times has an entire team now devoted to covering race and ethnicity, and that's about social justice. So, and then in addition to that, many digital organizations like BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post and Vice, they have made a name by covering some of the most difficult stories. And it's because if you go to these organizations, you see, for the most part, a very young staff that's very passionate and not shackled by the business imperatives of the legacy media, which is why it was easy. And I want to give them credit for being there before some of the more legacy media organizations in our recent history. So, but before we celebrate, we have got to acknowledge as a profession that we had this legacy and we let it slip out of our fingers, and we are just now grabbing hold of it again. We have to acknowledge that the institutions that we work for could have done more. So let's get back to that moment where I suggested that we do something different, that we look in a different place for stories. I remember that meeting, and I remember realizing that I was doing a very poor job of selling my idea to my editor, because he had this tilted head, bemused look on his face. And he was a good editor, right? I'm not bringing this up to disparage anybody in their personal choices, because this was a system that had gone awry. This wasn't any one individual. But he sort of tilted his head and looked at me like I was crazy and said, you know, I'm not sure that our audience is interested in these stories. I'm really interested in these stories. I'm personally very interested, but I don't think our audience would be. And I remember thinking, well, of course they wouldn't be. They're not the ones who the deck is stacked against them. We've done everything that we possibly could to serve the audience that has benefited from inequality. And so this is about 1995, 96 probably. And that initiative, that idea that I had went nowhere. And that was because by then I wasn't at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I was at this newspaper in the Northwest. But every place was the same. We were all making similar choices. And those choices were driven by a number of forces, including the business imperatives that we were living under to cater to a certain audience, to make our product valuable for advertisers. So this is not a simple problem to solve. But it was endemic, and that was true in Cleveland, it was true in Seattle, it was true in Spokane, it was true in St. Pete, it was true everywhere. We deliberately turned away from stories that did not concern the white, middle, and upper class. So compare that to now, where stories about injustice take root in social media, and they spread across the continent like that. This moment has been a long time coming, and it's a gift to us because of this rich media environment that we live in, where everybody can create content, and that content resonates with different audiences, and those audiences then push that content, push those stories, those very dramatic stories, they push them into the consciousness of all of us through the tools that we have, through Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat. This is a moment that is a gift to us because now we can see that people really do care. People have the power to tell their own stories, and they also have the power to choose stories that they consume in a way that they never could before. And so like this, we got here because of the internet, not because of any choices that we've made as journalists. But where the internet is great at surfacing injustice and documenting and distributing particular stories of inequality, it's not very good at all at fixing the broken systems that got us here. And so this is where we all come in. Earlier this year, Poynter had the opportunity, the privilege really, of kicking off a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Pulitzer Prizes. And the theme for our event was social justice. There were 4 of these events, and ours was themed around social justice. And that's because if you look at the awards that the Pulitzer Prizes have handed out over 100 years, They have, as early as 1910, they were highlighting stories about social justice and rewarding them to say to the profession, this is the best that you can do. This is the most important work that you can do, and we want to reward it and draw attention to it. And in doing so, hopefully inspire others to aspire to do that kind of work. So we assembled an amazing resource, and if you just Google Pulitzer and Poynter, you will find a link to that resource page that has all of the social justice themed work that the Pulitzers have awarded prizes to over 100 years. And it's an amazing thing to look at. And after looking at hundreds of award winners spanning the entire century, my colleague Roy Peter Clark identified 3 characteristics that are present in all social justice reporting. And we have to keep these 3 characteristics in mind as we go forward. So these 3 qualities illustrate the basic tenets of social justice journalism. And I'm literally quoting directly from Roy here. It often requires a combination of moral and physical courage. We find that journalists are threatened physically and financially for shining a light on hatred and intolerance and corruption, that there is a real cost to this. We also see a second quality is that social justice journalism is a mode, not a genre. It takes many different forms, from reports and investigations to editorials and cartoons. It expresses itself not just in nonfiction, in journalism, but also in the arts, in poetry, in fiction, in drama, and in music. It crosses all of these genres, and it is a mode of expression. And we have to remember to engage that mode. And then finally, social justice journalism often requires unusual methods and the marshaling of considerable resources to impress upon the public the need for change. And this is really important. In these cases, a lot of times it meant that a long series and a bunch of cartoons and enterprising marketing strategies, that it takes this entire effort to be committed to social justice journalism. So here we are. We're about to spend the day looking at modern social justice journalism and the people that do it. And let's remember what it takes, because it takes courage. It takes, if you want to boil down that second bullet point, it takes institutional focus, and it takes resources. And it really takes all 3 of those. I'm hoping that as an industry, we don't mess this up. I really am. Because if we approach this topic with humility and with the constant reminder that our past actions are part of the scenario, and we approach this with a dedication to remain vigilant, we can stop becoming part of the problem and become part of the solution. And so that's really what I hope we embrace today, is an acknowledgement that we as journalists have been on both sides of this fight. We have been part of the problem and part of the solution. And if we're going to go forward, we have to do it with commitment and dedication, courage, and this vigilance to do it every single day. It's not a single project, although single projects can often get a lot done, but it is a mindset that we serve the public around the issue of social justice journalism. So that's my story. Thank you. Do you want to